We're tremendously privileged to have with us today David Albrecht. David is a socialist and anti-fascist organiser from Austria. He is a member of our sister organisation Linkswende, which means left turn, and he has been at the heart of organising mass opposition to the FPO. As you will discover, the FPO are the bad guys in this talk. David will talk for about half an hour, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion. So, over to you, David.
Thank you. Comrades, to begin with, I want to thank you for inviting me, for having me here. It's a great pleasure to speak to you and to learn also from your experiences, from your movement. And I had some great days already spending in Melbourne, giving some talks. And now I came to Sydney, and when I came here from the airport to the first branch meeting, I saw pictures of a guy called, I learned, Clive Palmer, putting up, like, make Australia great. And it seems like Trump is stalking me in a way. Everywhere I go, I see some kind of Trump versions. And I also learned that Trump may come in November here to Australia, and I hope that you can really make the hell here for him when he arrives. I also learned that Clive Palmer is planning to build a Titanic 2, and maybe it's a good idea to put all the racists and fascists on this Titanic 2 and send them to an iceberg or so. Of course, it's a real threat what is happening, but at the same time, resistance is growing everywhere. I'm organizer for a united front we have in Austria called the Platform for a Humane Asylum Policy. There are other united fronts in Europe building up, in Germany, Stand Up to Racism, also Stand Up to Racism in Great Britain. We have the CARE movement against fascism and racism in Greece and elsewhere. You have different kinds of coalitions like the refugee campaigns, REC and so on. I think that are quite useful tools, and we have to build all these coalitions to fight against racism and the fascists. I mean, the threat posed by the far right is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, challenges of our lifetime. And the context in which this is happening, I can just go into briefly it. Is very clear. Since the outbreak of the crisis in 2007 and 2008, we are experiencing years of austerity, of cuts, of the ruling classes trying to make life harder for the working class people in their interests. And all over the world, the traditional parties, labor parties, as well as the traditional right-wing parties, conservative parties, have been squeezed, and there is a massive polarization to the left and to the right. We see to the left new projects like we've seen Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, Bernie Sanders in the US, and there were welcome developments. And on the other hand, we see upcoming of so-called right-wing populist parties and also real fascist forces in the parliaments, but also in the streets. And what really I think is important to see is that the dynamic that is going on at the moment, because since the election of Donald Trump in the US, there has been a real rise of fascist and right-wing movements and parties, not just in Europe, but all across the world. And Trump really sought to build alliances between the US government and right-wing governments in Europe, with Viktor Orban in Hungary, with the Austrian government, which is a coalition government of the Conservative Party and the Freedom Party, with the new Italian government of the Conservatives and the Lega, the Fascist Lega, and so on. And the dynamic that we see is that all these right-wing populist and far-right and fascist parties are really using the racism of the traditional parties of the center and putting it to a real extreme, putting the racism against refugees and Muslims to the most extreme form. And these parties are really pushing the center parties to adopt to this racism. Supposedly moderate forces like the German Chancellor Angela Merkel is giving concessions, making concessions to all these kind of forces. And this in turn forces back and strengthens the far right. So this is a kind of spiral that is building up, a real dangerous shift of politics to the right, of more racism. A real turning point in this racist drive to the right has been the latest summit of the European Union in the end of June, where the officials, all the politicians that met, ministers of chancellors and head of the state, really put the agenda of the far right and make it their own. They are setting up, trying to set up new concentration camps for refugees in North Africa, in the Sub-Sahara, and so on. They are plans to erect camps in Germany on the southern border to Austria. They are closing the borders. They are reintroducing border controls. And as we see, this is a kind of a chain reaction, because Germany closed the border to Austria, and Austria is closing the border to Slovenia and Italy to the south, and then Italy is holding back refugees from coming to Italy into Europe. And what we really can see is that this racist drive is not just talk, but we can see how real fascists, racists are encouraged, and we see more attacks on migrants, on refugees, on Muslims. We see that NGO ships trying to rescue refugees in the Mediterranean are being stopped by going into the Mediterranean, and once they have refugees on board, then there is no safe haven for them. They're looking for countries where they can go into a haven. And all this reminds us of the 1930s, when we have ships with Jews fleeing from Central Europe and trying to get to a safe haven elsewhere in the world. So, as I said, this also gives confidence to real fascist forces on the streets. It has been a very serious development when in Britain, just a couple of weeks, 15,000 neo-Nazis marched in support of Tommy Robinson, who was the leader of the English Defence League, a street fighting force. And immediately after he was released from prison, fascists attacked the socialist bookshop, Bookmarks, in central London. After an anti-fascist demo, a leading trade unionist was attacked by a fascist attack squad. And so this really shows you how dangerous this is if it is unchallenged, what we are facing. So the situation is very, very dangerous. And Austria plays a very significant role in all this at the moment. We have a government, as I said, between the Conservative Party and the fascist Freedom Party, it calls himself. It has nothing to do with freedom, but it's just the freedom they want again in speaking out loudly for their fascist ideas they have. Austria is now heading the European Union Council for this half of a year, and their whole agenda is about increasing the racism, make life harder for refugees. The European Union Council presidency takes place under the slogan, "A Europe that protects." They're not protecting refugees, They are saying we have to protect Europe, we have to build a fortress Europe against migrants, against refugees who are coming to Europe for a kind of Islamization. The policy that they introduced, or better to say, they strengthened in the European Union summit. I mean, it's been going on for quite some time, for some years now, has already increased in the death rate in the Mediterranean. When we compare, since Matteo Salvini in Italy took office, the new Minister of Interior, and when you compare June of 2018 with June 2015, the death rate was 8 times higher, meaning 8 times more refugees drowned in the Mediterranean compared to the arrivals in Europe. And this discourse is driven by the far right, which has won significantly in the recent elections. The Austrian Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, is using his coalition partners for alliances all over Europe, calling them axis from Berlin to Rome. And it was in the 30s, in the upcoming Second World War, that Hitler and Mussolini had his axis Berlin-Rome. So you can see conservative politicians taking up the fascist language. In just one, why they're doing this is of course it's clear, because they want to attract their alliances, their coalition partners, which have links, even if they're not real fascists, as the Austrian Freedom Party. And it's really important to see how this relationship functions between traditional right-wing parties and right-wing populist and fascist forces to the right. The main presentation is that the conservatives are just pushed by the fascist parties, but I think it's more complicated and complex than that. It's an intertwined relationship between the traditional right-wing parties and the fascist forces in one form or another. We say that the Freedom Party acts as like a chain dog for the conservatives. The agenda of the conservative neoliberal parties is to push through a neoliberal agenda, meaning cutting wages, cutting social services. In the case of Austria, one of the main things is they want to introduce a 12-hour working day again, since when we have fought more than 100 years ago for the 8-hour working day. And the Conservative Party is using the fascist forces to intimidate all their opponents inside Parliament and also outside Parliament. If Sebastian Kurz, the Chancellor, wants to succeed, he has to constantly serve his right-wing voters by continuing to heat up the racist and xenophobic mood. And he's using the fascist party for their brutality and their ruthlessness. Just take the Minister of Interior of Austria saying in the beginning of the year that he wants to again concentrate, it's a quote, concentrate refugees in camps. He's saying, I want to erect concentration camps. And it was the Austrian economist August von Hayek, who is kind of the role model for the neoliberal era, that once wrote that sometimes you need coercion when there is no voluntary conformity. So you can really see that the neoliberal conservative parties are using the fascists for pushing through their agenda. And in return, what the fascists get is their rehabilitation. They can build up a fascist core, they can recruit and really can change the climate where at some point a real fascist street movement can grow. There are some lessons that we can learn from what the Austrian Freedom Party is doing now in government. And I just want to focus on 3 points here. They learned their lessons from their first experience in government in 2000. In 2000 we had kind of the same coalition of the Conservatives and the Freedom Party, and at the time the Freedom Party sent to the government more or less neoliberal figures that could do anything they want. And this created a lot of problems within the Freedom Party. Eventually it came to a split, to a party conference in 2002, and then to a split. And they had a lot of trouble in rebuilding the Fascist Party because all of their neoliberal agenda was destroying, in a way, their base. The base turned away again from the Freedom Party. So they had to rebuild, and they learned the lesson. And now they were sending their hardcore fascist cadres into the ministries. It's a little bit complicated because these corporations, I'm not talking about, just exist in Austria and in Germany. They're called Burschenschaften, meaning these are very right-wing fascist student corporations that have their origins in the 19th century and became fast very, very anti-Semitic, authoritarian, and then played a crucial role in the Nazi machine, meaning running the death camps, running the trains going to the death camps, and so on. And these Burschenschaften control really the Freedom Party. I mean, Strache, the leader of the fascist party, he is a Burschenschafter. To give you some kind of idea how strong these right-wing student corporations are, when you look at the MPs in Parliament from the Freedom Party, 40% of them are coming out of this Burschenschaften. So they took their lessons to hold the party together when they are in government, and they sent them all over the ministries as press speakers, as their assistants, and so on. And I would say to the ministries, just a thing in the moment. The real threat here is that the fascist Freedom Party is now in charge of the complete repressive apparatus of the state. They have the Ministry of Interior and they have the Defense Ministry. So, meaning that they have the control over the police, the intelligence service, and the military. And what they are doing at the moment is, through their participation in government, in building a real fascist core. The police is recruiting 4,000 new police officers, and the Ministry of Interior, Herbert Kickl, he is putting advertisements in neo-Nazi magazines for the police. And you have on the one page this advertisement, and on the next page you have an interview with the Minister of Interior. So they're recruiting neo-Nazis to the police. This for itself is something very dangerous that is already happening. They are piling up or setting up a new border control, a border police force for that they cannot enter Austria from the borders from Slovenia and Italy. They are giving until the end of the year 2019 6,500 automatic assault rifles to the police. So this is how they're trying to attract racists and fascists to the police. But they do not stop by that. They have a special police union where they then try to recruit all these new officers, and also, of course, officers they're already in the police, to the party. And this is their way of building a fascist core that once the time is right, can really build a fascist street movement. The third point I wanted to say to the fascists in government is that they are very well aware that they have to build their own independent movement. If you would go to Austria and I would show you, this is the Conservative Party and this is the Fascist Party, and you just look at their racism that they're using, you wouldn't can tell who is who. But when you really look under the surface what is happening, as I told you that they are recruiting, you can see that they have their own agenda. A leading FPÖ politician, Freedom Party politician, he was speaking quite openly about how they what strategy they are using, what they already achieved, and what their next goals are. When he was talking to the Alternative for Germany, they have close links with all the right-wing parties in Europe, and he was saying that the so-called elites move decisively to the left, but I can't tell any examples here because this is always dangerous. He's saying here that we are well aware that we are just using the Conservative Party for our own agenda. I can tell openly because, then the media and all the kind of the journalists and will come and trying to drive a wedge between this new government. But they are well aware that they have to prop up this anti-establishment mood like Trump is doing constantly. And this means propping up racism again and again for their own agenda. And I want to stress this point here really for a moment, that fascism is really a distinctive moment and has its own agenda. They're not just using racism for getting votes, so they are really using racism for building a massive street force at some point that can really bring terror about against migrants, refugees, Muslims, Jews, and so on. So how many minutes? Yeah. Okay. I talk a little bit about our role, what we did now in trying to stop the fascists and in fighting racism. Revolutionary socialists can really play a central role in throwing back the racist and neoliberal offensive. We were able to, when in 2015 hundreds of thousands of refugees came to Europe through the borders. I mean, they were literally tearing down the fences when they're marching in the streets from the Balkan route, from Hungary to Austria, and then they were welcomed by their supporters in Austria. At this time, even before, hundreds of thousands in Austria were helping refugees, collecting donations, providing food and shelter, going to the train stations, welcoming refugees, and so on. And at the moment, we said we have to build a united front to gather all these peoples, the refugees themselves and their supporters, for building a political platform where we can really counter the racism of the government. And we managed to establish a platform, a united front that we called Platform for a Humane Asylum Policy, that ranged from the Green Party, from parties affiliated with the Labour Party, and youth organizations, for example, an important NGO that is working together with children against poverty, refugee aid organizations in different towns. And you have to see that in every small town, some small initiatives arose in helping refugees, giving German courses, and so. We managed to bring them all together with refugees organizing for themselves. We have a very important organization that is called Refugees for Refugees, that established themselves in one of the camps and then spread out in Austria. And immediately after the fences and the borders were open in September in 2015, the then government of Labour and Conservative was starting a racist backlash. They were erecting a fence to the border of Slovenia, talking about closing the border to Italy at the time, propping up the racism against Muslims by debating of banning the headscarf and all that kind of stuff. And the platform we had was very important in organizing the resistance against this backlash. It took not long when the Freedom Party, at the time in the opposition, was trying to take advantage of the racist backlash of the government. And they were trying to copy the German Islamophobic Pegida movement and were organizing 2 marches against refugee centers in 2 districts and in Vienna. And it was our platform that organized a street blockade in both occasions, and we outnumbered them by, we had mobilized twice or a third time that the Nazis did, and they had immediately afterwards stopped their trying of building the street movement. So you can, just to make a point here, that you can also see that the Freedom Party, when they think the situation is right, they were really trying to build the street movement. Yeah, we further then participated, was a very important step for us in going on the march demonstrations on the International Day Against Racism, when you have just 1 week later the Palm Sunday rallies and so on. But despite our victories, the racist backlash led to a heavy uncertainty among anti-fascists. And before the general elections, which took place last year, before that we had presidential elections, which come on to a runoff between a Green candidate and the fascist candidate. And eventually nobody was organizing demos or protests against the Freedom Party candidate. We were the only ones that were saying "fuck Hofer." Hofer, who he was the candidate at the time, and it was so decisive that we, Left Turn, kept flying the flag and hold our position during this very difficult time. We were organizing protests before the general elections, saying "fuck Strache," the leader of the Freedom Party. Strache, he sued us for that because we showed him the middle finger and said "fuck" to him. But eventually we won the court case in February this year, so now you can officially, legally say "fuck" to Strache and show him the middle finger. Yeah. And all this, what we did in doing the protests, taking on with Strache before court, and so really gave confidence again to anti-fascists that you can do something about it. There were small protests, but they grew bigger again. And we really turned the tide. When the election results came in October last year, we organized a protest, and this was the time when really the youth organizations of labor, different NGOs, some trade unionists, important trade unionists, came to our protest, and we marched through the whole city and really showing that resistance is possible against the new government. Then, and on the inauguration day of the government, we had 10,000 people on the streets in December, and then in the beginning of the year, our platform managed to mobilize 70,000 people against the new government, speaking out against racism and austerity. Then in June, something also very important happened when 120,000 trade unionists marched in the streets. And just to give an impression, Austria has 8 million inhabitants, and we in Vienna are living 2 million people, so 120,000 at least. This is something we have never seen in the last years, and it completely were shop stewards, trade unionists, and it was called by the Trade Union Federation from above. So a very important development. This demo was against the introduction of the 12-hour working day, and our role again as revolutionary socialists was, of course, to build this demo and to have a political intervention in saying that refugees are welcome here. Our platform put up the slogan "No to the 12-hour working day" and "Yes to the culture of welcoming refugees." And we had also, as Turn Left, posters where we have him over the posters over there. "Don't let Nazis govern and never let them have the streets," because we think it's so important that we expose the Nazis as what they are, that they're real fascists. I mean, they're saying we are the Freedom Party or something like that. They're having ties and suits on and so. But this is the hardcore Nazis with links to the Nazis of the 20s and 30s. I have to come to an end. Some conclusions maybe, and then we can go into the discussion. I think it's very important that fighting racism against Muslims, against refugees, and so fighting this racism is the real challenge of the left. But the left can also grow on this issue. Those who are principled, who are the most ideologically trained, will prevail in all these movements, and we shouldn't forget in building within these movements. We say Muslims and refugees are at the heart of the struggles, and where we can, we seek the broadest possible united front. We're working with all together who say we have to say no to racism, no to deportations, no to the camps, and so on. Second, we must never let the fascists have the streets. We could see in Germany what was happening with the emergence of the Pegida movement, just in one city, in Dresden. But this gave confidence to fascists everywhere. They were not really challenged from the beginning, growing and growing from each Monday to Monday when they were demonstrating. And this then really created the space where the alternative for Germany was formed. And then last year, it was for the first time since years that a real right-wing populist to fascist party, it's not yet decided what the AfD in Germany is, but could go into parliament. So we have to really smash them in the streets whenever they're trying to march. Just think of what could happen when they are strong in parliament and also controlling the streets. It makes life, not just for revolutionary socialists or for leftists or for trade unionists, the life worse, but just think of what this could mean for refugees, for migrants, for Muslims, and so on. This is really, we have to take on. And third, we have to really build a radical left alternative in all these movements. It's often the right-wing parties that are meaning the fascist parties and the right-wing populist parties that are the only ones that signal, if you vote for us, everything will be changed. I mean, there's a real anger at the political center, at the establishment, and so on. And they are the only ones that saying we are taking on the establishments, and then they're trying to use this mood and going into a right-wing direction, in a racist direction. So the working class and the revolutionary left has really had to offer a lead in the fight against austerity and against the capitalist system. We cannot just hold and fighting all the measures they're doing, but we have to provide a perspective out of the system because people are fed up with the system. They're, for years, the elites are telling them, you will have it better one day. And they are really fed with all these offers they present. So, to end with our next project with the United Front of the Platform for Human Asylum Policies, we will protest on the 13th of September against the European Union Summit in Vienna on the issue of refugees and migrants. And we're trying to build this protest as massive as possible. And 2 days later, just my time here in Melbourne and in Sydney, we organized a demo together with our German comrades with Stand Up to Racism. We are doing a protest on the 15th of September on the border between Austria and Germany, organizing 2 demos from both sides, meeting in the middle and tearing down the fences. To end with, refugees and migrants are not the danger. The real danger lies in the rise of the far right. The real danger lies in more and more racism against Muslims and refugees. The real danger lies in the Mediterranean, where by day refugees are drowning because of Fortress Europe. The real danger lies in the neoliberal attacks on the working classes of Europe and the world and the bosses and their capitalist system. We stand for open borders, and we oppose all immigration controls. We say open the borders, and the more refugees are in, the less racists and Nazis are in.